sit down and say shalom. I'm David Benkof. I'm the Broadway Maven, and you are in for a treat today. In 2025, no musical is having a greater impact on the art form, particularly in its cinematic version, than Wicked. And this afternoon's panel will welcome the property's writers, novelist Gregory Maguire, who's our and script and screenwriter Winnie Holzman. Here's a preview of what you can expect. I'll be asking questions along with two accomplished academics whose work has directly explored Wicked's significance and meaning. I've invited the panelists, Mr. Maguire and Ms. Holzman, to ask each other a question, and then we'll open the floor to questions from those of you in the audience. But first, let me introduce you to the people that you'll be hearing from today. Dr. Salamishah Tillet is a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, scholar, and cultural critic whose work explores race, gender, and popular culture. The Henry Rector's Professor of Africana Studies and Creative Writing at Rutgers University in Newark, she has written thoughtfully about Wicked, including 3 essays for the New York Times, analyzing its cultural resonance, feminist themes, and evolving legacy. Dr. Tillet examines how Wicked redefines female friendship, power, and resistance in musical theater, particularly in relation to race and contemporary politics. Her writing brings Wicked into broader conversations about social justice, representation, and storytelling, solidifying its place as a transformative work in American culture. Welcome. Dr. Stacy Wolf. Where's my prop?
Right there.
There we go. So Dr. Stacy Wolf is a leading scholar of musical theater and feminist criticism, best known for her book, Changed for Good, A Feminist History of the Broadway Musical, which dedicates 2 chapters to Wicked. A professor at Princeton University, Dr. Wolf explores how Wicked challenges traditional gender roles, presenting complex, powerful female protagonists in a genre historically dominated by male narratives. Her analysis situates Wicked within a broader feminist lineage, arguing that its success reshapes the landscape of Broadway. Through her scholarship, Dr. Wolf has helped establish Wicked as one of the most significant and progressive musicals of the 21st century. And I'm proud to call her a person of friend. So welcome. And I'm the Broadway Maven David Benkof. I have made Broadway appreciation both my hobby and my career. I aim to help my students and my readers think more deeply about musical theater, and that's what we'll be doing today. Before we meet our guests, Winnie? Yes, wonderful. Before we meet our guests, just a quick note, there are many surveys in the room to help you decide what I'm offering next year, plus a spot to put your email address for a subscription to my Substack, and you also have a chance to write your questions for the panelists on little pieces of paper. If you're part of the Broadway Maven team and can collect them, there's Steve in the back, here's Mateo, they'll be collecting, there's Tatiana, they'll be collecting questions and bringing them to me, instead of just bringing people to the microphones and saying, what's your question, or having me read the question. You'll write your questions, I'll pick some of them and call on you, so be sure to put your name next to your question. And I am thrilled to be at BroadwayCon for my 3rd year in a row. Any luck with Mr. Maguire? Does anybody know? Oh! Please! Gregory Maguire is an American novelist, best known for his imaginative workings of classic fairy tales, particularly Wicked, the life and times of the Wicked Witch of the West, which inspired the Broadway musical Wicked. His novels blend dark fantasy with social and political commentary, offering fresh perspectives on well-known stories. He earned a PhD in English and American Literature from Tufts University, where his research focused on thematic structures in 20th century children's fantasy literature, and he has made significant contributions to literature for both adults and young readers. And Winnie Holzman. There you go. Winnie Holzman is a book writer and screenwriter best known for Wicked, the blockbuster musical that reimagines The Wizard of Oz through the lens of female friendships. Her television credits include being the creator of My So-Called Life, the acclaimed 1994 TV drama that set a new standard for teen storytelling. She also wrote the screenplay for the two-part Wicked adaptation, one of which has been a tremendous success with critics and fans alike. Known for her emotionally resonant writing, Ms. Holzman crafts stories that balance humor, heart, and depth. We're going to start with Dr. Tillet in a moment, but if you have questions yourself, it's a good time to write them down, and the team is collecting. Dr. Tillet.
Yeah, well, I thought we would all begin with our own Wicked origin stories, and I think you'll share your own
Great idea.
again. And then I'll just ask both of you a question. So I joked in our pre-panel session that I'm a bit of an interloper, right? That I'm visiting the Wicked world and then have been completely enthralled and enraptured. But I came into Wicked through my son, who is a big fan of, I noticed when he was little that he had this thing called following cultural patterns. And I was like, when he was like 3 years old, I'm like, well, I think you may find this thing called The Wizard of Oz really interesting because it then gets adapted into The Wiz. And then so for our birthdays trips, we would come to see Wicked, and then we also saw The Wiz last year on Broadway, and then when it started touring in Baltimore. So I come to this as someone who has been excited, interested, enthralled in the world of The Wiz and The Wizard of Oz, and then have a kid who's really into musical theater, and so it's been really exciting to become part of the Wicked world that you all, and because of you and Winnie in many ways. So my first question is just basically, you know, The Wizard of Oz is such a dominant, big American story. And what's interesting, I didn't realize you had your PhD in American literature, so that actually kind of makes a lot of sense now. But when you decided to take on this like epic American story that gets turned into a film that starts off as a series of novels, you know, what brought you, I know some of the answers to this, but what intimidated you about taking on that story? What brought you to that story? And then where in your life were you able to like imagine you're going to take the most complicated villain and render her a heroine?
Well, Winnie, you can clap off now because I'm going to be talking for the next hour. I am known for saying too much and too slowly, but I will try to answer briefly. Like many of you in this room, I came to The Wizard of Oz first through the 1939 film. My parents were very strict, and we were not very prosperous. We didn't go to movies because there were 7 kids. But we did watch one movie a year, and every year it was the same movie. So The Wizard of Oz on TV became part of our liturgical season. It was part of the holidays of Christianity, of Americanness. It was part of the calendar of festivity and terror. All holidays are about both happiness and terror. And the airing of The Wizard of Oz caused all of us to lose bladder control at about minute, I don't know, 72. When the flying monkeys came down and scooped up Dorothy in a kind of early version of Uber, I think it was, to take her to the castle, where she was going anyway, so which was giving her a lift. I don't know what the big deal was about that. We were all terrified, and the sofa had to be steam washed the next day every week. I am a reading person, and I was a reading child, and I was raised by the library and librarians as much as I was by my well-meaning and very effective parents. The Wizard of Oz is one of the few stories that I got through popular entertainment rather than from the book first, and that's because the movie was on. So when the movie was done, I would take my 6 brothers and sisters and I would corral the neighborhood kids into our backyard and we would play The Wizard of Oz the next day. We didn't need scripts because we all knew the story by heart and even the lines by heart. It's amazing how when you have a movie that's 92 minutes long or so, you can actually run through it in 12 minutes if you cut out the music. So that was the beginning of my understanding that stories were commonly held material of the culture. And I started inventing with the story when I was about 6.
Thank you. Wonderful.
So, Dr. Wolf, your connection to the property. Oh, Dr. Wolf, yeah, sure.
Well, hi everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi Gregory. I loved what you just said just now because I've never actually heard you talk about that specifically, acting it out in your backyard. That's very touching to me. And of course, it's not dissimilar that Stephen and I, as we've said in many an interview, as children, we were both really, to use the doctor's word, enthralled by the Wizard of Oz movie, and we watched it every year as well. And so that is a big part of our, I don't need to speak for Stephen Schwartz, he can speak for himself, but I know him pretty well. That was a big part of our connection, the emotion of our connection to Gregory's Wicked novel. Because of our reverence for that movie and how it evokes our childhood for us. And the novel itself, Gregory's novel is so, it blew my mind. When I first realized, even before I read it, when I first realized what it was about and what he had done, those opening lines where he has, I think I'm accurate, Gregory, where you have him in a tree, looking down at the witch hunters, as we call them, and sort of plotting their next moment and vulnerable, in a sense, in that tree. It just blew my mind to turn that story around and be seeing things from her POV. So, I think that's my answer of just how incredibly evocative and brilliant an idea that is, and continues to be. One of the reasons that I think Stephen and I were able to stay with the making of the movie first, the way we did, and for all the years that we were developing it, is because of the power of the ideas of the premise, which is Gregory's brilliant premise that you don't know. You think you know this story, you don't know the real story, the story behind the story, and you're judging someone from the surface, and you're not seeing this person as a person.
So I'm going to ask who's doing the tech to leave me up here so I don't forget her again, and so we can see all of us at the same time, if that's possible. Dr. Wolf, if you share your connection with the show. No? Oh.
Maybe she's there. Maybe she's there small.
Oh, I see her. Okay. Yeah, she's there. Okay.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, David, for putting this panel together. It's so awe-inspiring to meet you, and awe-inspiring to meet you, and wonderful to see Winnie, my dear friend on Zoom. And I also really wanted to thank the BroadwayCon staff. I know there are a lot of volunteers. Huge operation, so thank you all so much for making everything move so smoothly and so generously and graciously. So a little bit of my Wicked story. I grew up doing musical theater and was a huge fan. I'm a huge fan of Winnie's from television, and Stephen Schwartz, grew up on all of his shows, and went to see Wicked shortly after it opened in 2003, and looked around the theater and could not understand how every person in the room did not see that this was a feminist and queer Rodgers and Hammerstein show. Wait, are people acting like this is a normal thing here? This is not a normal thing here. This is so remarkable, brilliant, incredible to take this structure, the greatest structural creators of musical theater are Rodgers and Hammerstein, and tell this story with two women. It was beyond brilliant. In addition to being so funny, and the songs are amazing, and the movie is unbelievably great. But that was my first experience, just thinking, okay, here we are, let's go, we're in a whole new world. So my question for Winnie is, it is very hard for us to imagine what the musical theater landscape was like before Wicked. It is so a part of our zeitgeist now, it's so a part of our culture now. It transformed musical theater. It opened the route for female leads, female friendships, female-driven stories that had never happened before. How did you and Stephen Schwartz, obviously inspired by Gregory's novel, how were you brave enough to do that, or crazy enough to do that, or how did you think that you could write a musical built around a female couple?
Okay, great question. Great to see you, Stacy. You know, I think my answer has to do with it's really personal. Okay, this has to do with how thrilled I was to be working with Stephen Schwartz, an American treasure. You know, the first time I wrote a musical, full-length musical, it took, you know, it was many years of my life. And it ran for about 2 months, and I learned a lot. You always learn so much writing anything. And then I went, not on purpose, it's just my life brought me into television writing, and I fell in love with writing TV. What I'm trying to say is that when I got this opportunity, and Stephen actually said to me, I would love to write this musical with you, my focus, everyone, was I wanted to be there for Stephen Schwartz. And I wanted to figure out together with him how best to tell the story. I was not thinking feminism. I was not thinking any ism. I was really focused on how can we best tell the story. But what we were doing was we were really pleasing ourselves. We both grew up with Rodgers and Hammerstein scores and shows in our head and our hearts. Just as Gregory was saying, he was in the backyard acting out. You know, I just knew all the lyrics to every Rodgers and Hammerstein, you know, musical song. So what I'm trying to say is that I was really focused on the basics. How can we really tell this story? What is our story? Those basics that you're always asking yourself, what is really the story? You know, then you answer it, then you have to answer it again because you realize you didn't the heart of it. And when we had our big breakthrough and we realized that the story was going to be really fundamentally about the friendship of these two women and how these two women intersect, their lives intersect and change each other's lives for good, that was a breakthrough. And I remember having a moment when I thought, I wonder if there's ever been a musical that was about the friendship of two women. And I thought, and I realized, I'm not sure, you know, I don't know everything about musicals. I'm not an expert on musicals, and I mean, hardly. But I thought to myself, I don't think there ever has been. And I admit that made me feel great. That got me energized. But that came organically out of us trying to tell the story the best way we could.
Did you have a follow-up?
Amazing. Yeah, that's for now. Yeah.
So I had forgotten I was going to tell my connection to this property. It's really interesting because when I was 4 years old, the first show I ever saw was The Wizard of Oz. And I saw it at Uni in St. Louis. Any St. Louisans here? It's the largest outdoor theater in the United States. I was 4 years old, and we had The Wizard of Oz. We had the best Wicked Witch you could possibly have, the best casting. It was Margaret Henry. In 1939, she was young, but witches can be old. So in the show, and my parents told me, David, there's going to be the real witch in the show, and I thought it was going to be a real witch. So anyway, that's my initial connection to this show. Now, I have a couple of questions, but I understand that Winnie has something to share about Glinda's last name.
Well, Gregory, is it okay if I mention that? Because I've never mentioned this in any interview ever.
Woo!
Sure.
Okay, so when I was naming Glinda, Gregory has a long name for her in the novel. I wanted another name, last name, because Elphaba is Elphaba Throck, which is like the perfect name. And I wanted another name for her that was a little shorter than the name that Gregory gave her in the novel. And I realized that, am I correct about this, Gregory, that you lived on, didn't you live on a street called Upland?
I have lived at 3 different addresses on streets called Upland.
It just came to me that Upland was a perfect name for her. And then I thought of the Upper Uplands, because that was probably where she was going to come from, that she was the Glinda that I thought she was, that Gregory helped us to, that painted in the novel. So that's my little tidbit of trivia that nobody knows that. Except Harry.
Initially, in my initial contact, asked you to break some news if you could, and you said, well, I'm not really allowed to, and you did, so I do.
Well, I have a return favor for you, that you may not know this, Winnie, because we've only met in person 3 or 4 times over 25 years. It's too bad. So by the way, let me say congratulations on the movie. It's already
I don't mean to correct you.
I forgot my burlesque book, but in fact, nobody, I believe, has ever asked me where Elphaba's last name comes from. And her name is Elphaba Throck. Maybe you do know this. Throck is the sound that a house makes when it falls on your sister. I did not want it to be a pretty name. And neither first or last name, I did not want it to be elegant and sinuous and sensuous. Elphaba Throck, the slapstick.
But one of the things that I learned from Stephen Schwartz, ironically, is that songs play different roles in a show. That you need an I-1 number in a certain place, for example. How does splitting a musical, Winnie, into 2 parts affect the rules of show structure? And, for example, can we expect an I Want song in the second part?
Well, I can't talk about the second part of the movie. Or someone's going to drop a house on me. But I do want to say that we approached it when we realized it took us a very long time to decide to break it into 2 movies. There was a lot of deep conversation, and when we finally came to this conclusion, we realized that there was, in a way, you have to really approach it as 2 movies, and you have to set things up again in a way of what is going on now. And so it's like, you're not. But it's interesting in the show. Of course, it's very quick to understand. We have this, Every Day More Wicked. When people are first coming back from the intermission, that's what they see is and here is Every Day More Wicked, and this idea. And then Glinda comes out, and I think you could say in a way that she's singing a version of an I Want song.
Oh, yeah.
She's not singing an I Want song, perhaps in the sense that we so now she's, excuse me, now she's singing, you know, one of the most beautiful things, honestly, about a musical is that when people sing, often they're singing their deepest secret. You know, they speak, and that's what they would say presentationally in life. And then when they sing, they're singing their heart, their soul, their deepest yearning, their most, the thing they're most frightened of. That's part of what brings us to musicals so strongly, is that we're getting to know someone in such an intimate way. And so when she sings, I couldn't be happier, there's a level to where, you know, and that is obviously part of, towards the beginning of our second movie, there's a way in which I would say that is a form of an art.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to talk about allegory and adaptation, because part of what's exciting, every time you encounter one adaptation of The Wizard of Oz, it forces you to think about, like even The Drop makes you think about Dorothy differently, right? Like, so Dorothy's a heroine. If you watch Wicked, you're kind of like, hey, is she a heroine? And then when I saw The Wiz last year, I was like, I had much more kind of conflicted emotions about Dorothy, and actually looked at Eveline differently, even though, you know, that's in a different world, a different context. So my question is about this idea of adapting for you, for both of you, The Wizard of Oz, as a kind of political allegory, and what you were worried about, and did you feel intimidated, and what freedoms you had to do that. Obviously, I think the backdrop for you at the time was the Iraq War, and now you speed up to today, and I wrote about this at the Times, watching the movie, and a movie that only is cut off, and it's not cut off, but the part one leaves you with a feeling of incompleteness that the musical doesn't leave you with, right? And that incompleteness means that you have to feel the sense of dystopia a little bit more than you would with the musical, which is the feeling that you have. And feeling dystopic in this political moment has different meanings. So the question for you is allegory and adaptation. And I would say that The Wizard of Oz, Baum's book was always an allegory, and it always was a very political text. So it's not like anyone's doing anything new, just the politics may be different. And then I guess for Winnie, for you, even if the musical, you didn't perceive it as like a hyper-feminist text, you know that the musical is interpreted that way. And so when you're adapting and revising and reimagining it for a movie, how did the musical and how people have interpreted it impact your writing of the musical, knowing that it's going to land in a different moment and we're going to interpret it? So those are just two, like you adapting yourself in a way, and then you taking on this big text and showing us new politics, new ways of reading it.
Well, I'm going to possibly reject your assumption.
Okay.
And that is, if I'm remembering correctly, what an allegory actually is. I believe that an allegory can only function as so if every discrete part means one thing and one thing only. It stands in for itself unchangingly through the process of the story. Whereas my whole attempt was to take something that seemed at first like an allegory, like green-skinned people are bad, and every time that we thought we had reached the answer for why Elphaba was going to be wicked, or any character in the story, really, there was always a twist where we were obliged to stop and reconsider every character, every motivation, including her mother, the slut, including her father, who in my book was a minister, not a governor, but similarly an authoritarian figure, including the wizard, who was a despot on one hand and had been a failed business person on the streets of New York as an Irish immigrant on the other. I don't think that qualifies for an allegorical approach. Every time I thought, I'm going to bring Elphaba up to this point, and then I would realize some people are going to think, we finally got it. she was like the way she was because, one thing I didn't do, because she was abused by her father.
Yeah.
That was one thing I definitely stayed away from, because everybody was being abused by their father in the 80s and 90s. That was the answer to every trauma. That I didn't want to go there. But I went every other place, and every time I gave the reader a hint or a temptation to come to a conclusion, I flipped it at the last moment so that you had to keep looking at her, because that wasn't quite it. What is us is all of it. It's every temptation. It's every flip, which is going on at this moment as we're speaking. So that was what I wanted in Elphaba, to make her so human that we had to keep watching her, that we couldn't decide. That's what we need to do for each other. I'm not going to leave this room thinking, well, I got your number, and I know the cut of your jib. No, I don't have your number, and I don't know the cut of your jib, and I won't at the end of this hour either. That's why we have to keep being friends.
Everything Gregory Maguire said just underscores for me why Stephen and I felt such an affinity toward his work and felt so drawn. And again, I'm going to use your word enthralled. I love that word. I want to just make it clear that as we were writing it, I think it's natural for me to have things be feminist, because that I grew up, I went to Princeton when the first women that were accepted to Princeton were seniors and I was a freshman. Stacy teaches there. In other words, I wanted to go into a male-dominated environment and be one of the first women there. So I think my orientation is feminist, naturally. So I think I bring that to everything I write without having to kind of, when I've said before, my focus. So I wasn't sort of saying to myself, how am I going to make this feminist? But your question is so helpful, because yes, then we have the show is a success, and people are having very strong reactions to it. And I know that Gregory's book is so, among other things, it's so political. That's part of the DNA of the book. It's about a rise in fascism. So from the very beginning, Stephen Schwartz and I, that was part of the DNA of Wicked the musical. What's interesting, of course, and tragic, is that it's taken our country to sink this low, and to get this embroiled in fascistic ideas and in fascism itself, for people to notice, in other words, the political content of Wicked the musical was always the same political content. I've had so many people say to me after seeing the Broadway show, now, so after that person came into power, you rewrote. No, we haven't rewritten that show since 2006 when we were in London, and then it was a rewrite for artistic reasons. It wasn't to insert political material. The politics of Wicked has always been the same. The audience now is seeing it in a new light. It's partly wonderful and it's partly horror. What was I going to say? So yes, I just want to say that, partly in the casting of a woman of color, you didn't ask me that specifically, but that's a big part of the movie. I feel like that was done. That we wanted that very much. That was deliberate. That was a step where we just wanted to do that. I don't even think we had a long conversation. We had long, endless conversations about whether or not we should break it into two pieces, into two movies. We did not have long conversations about whether or not she should be a woman of color. We all knew it, it felt right, it was right. And, we didn't, thank God, it's not, Cynthia's a lot more than just a woman of color.
I was able to do the profile on Cynthia for the Times. And for those, everyone's seen the movie, obviously, hopefully. But one of the
Multiple times.
one of my favorite scenes is the moment when we see, and it's a trick of AGI, when she's moving, she goes from green to brown to green again. And one of the things that Cynthia said that I don't think made it into the article is that she was so excited at the end of the day to take off the makeup and to return back to her brown skin. And something about going through this transformative aspect or transformation of becoming Elphaba was again about loving your skin. So it's really a beautiful, I think, testament to embodying this character that's othered, and then also loving yourself, who's also othered in the real world at the same time. So I just wanted to say that, and just asking us.
I wanted to ask the two of you to talk some about language and world building. Gregory, the world that you create through all kinds of words that may or may not have ever been in the English language, and the way that you teach us. You teach us a new vocabulary, not only vocabulary of never being settled and never knowing. It's brilliantly plotted. The characters are amazing. But the world that you create in language is unbelievable. So I would love to hear you talk about language, where your linguistic imagination comes from, how you made word choices, and things about language. And then to Winnie, also about language, because one of the things that's so remarkable about Wicked is how it combines this teenage girl, contemporary, poppy, super relatable kind of language with the made-up words of Oz, with incredibly powerful lyrics that you and Stephen worked on that truly express character in the way that musicals do that best. So I would also love to hear you talk about language, and in the last session you talked about how important it was that you started as a poet and that you started by writing poetry and your attention to language that way. So could you talk about language?
I'll try to be brief. I'm a big reader, and I read big fat books, and I make it a project for my life to read the things that I don't want to die leaving unread. So, now in French, I did read all 7 volumes of Proust. It took me about 4 years. And I did go to Tolstoy, and when I was, 7th grade, I loved Gone with the Wind because it was so fat, and you didn't have to go back to the library for 2 whole weeks. and I think that in the world of fantasy, and this will lead toward a question I have for Winnie, because we were supposed to bring a question for each other. In the world of fantasy, I believe that people my generation who became fantasy writers because they were readers of fantasy effectively break down into 2 categories. It's not gay straight, it's not black white, it's Middle Earth or the Once and Future King. For me, that's where it breaks. And while I admired Middle Earth for many reasons, especially because of language, especially because of the sense of Tolkien's control of multiple languages, multiple mysterious names that were so evocative, you just couldn't wait to go back. In fact, I vote for T.H. White. And here's why. T.H. White, unlike Tolkien, is a comic writer as well as a writer about ethics. And I think that Wicked owes more to my love of the retelling of the Arthurian cycle by T.H. White than it owes to Tolkien. I tried to deepen and enrich the Land of Oz the way I thought Tolkien might have approached making up his land of Middle-earth. But the fuel in my engine was from T.H. White's question, does might equal right? You think about T.H. White, and you think that my stepmother, who's smarter than I was, pointed this out to me after the book was published. She said, you took your permission from T.H. White, didn't you? He took a story that everybody knew, and he told it again, as if nobody had heard it before. He didn't bother to apologize for it. He just threw you into the well with Wart and Merlin, and then you were hooked and carried along. He never apologized, he never explained. Good social rules at a dinner party. And furthermore, look what happened to his book. It was about might and right. It was about courage and isolation. And it also became a fabulous Broadway musical.
Your question for Winnie is that...
My question for Winnie kind of relates to this, and that is, Winnie, before you were a poet, and I never knew till today that you had poetry in your background, though I'm not surprised. When you were growing up, besides watching The Wizard of Oz as I did, what did you read, and did you care about fantasy literature as something to gravitate to when you went into your public library?
Well, first of all, Gregory Maguire, I love you so much. I just love you. It's ridiculous how little time we have spent together. But we are obviously have a soul connection through the wickedness. I was not a fantasy reader. I have to admit, and both of those wonderful books that you mentioned, I've never read those books.
There's still time. There's still time. Start with T.H. White, though, if you're feeling a little queasy. You need to get that done first.
I will. But the kind of books I used to fall into and never wanted to get out of were, I was obsessed with Louisa May Alcott. I read all those books. I read when I read Charlotte's Web. When I was a little girl, I cried and I was amazed at when Charlotte dies. Spoiler alert. When Charlotte dies at the end I cried, and I think I was about 8 years old, and I realized a book can make you cry, and that blew my mind. That blew my mind, and I love those books about. There's like a series of books of girls that all were at ballet school, and it was different shoes. It was called like dancer shoes.
Like Noah's Street Field, maybe?
Yep.
Noah's Street Field.
That was you're so awesome. Those books that I just adored. So did I answer your question? I really like the Stacy, to your question. I really like being playful with language. I guess you can tell from my work. And I feel like it's a lot of what we write, let's face it, and this is not to sound egotistical, far from it, but we're writing for ourselves. We're writing not just to learn something, but that's a big part of it. Because writing is so mysterious, and you're really not sure how it happens. And there's a way in which there's a strangeness about it that you never quite understand what you're doing. And I love that about writing. It's also very intimidating. But I find that I'm very much into pleasing myself. And I feel like the more I'm writing something that really, and just to jump around for a second, when I first read the novel, Gregory's novel, there were so many details, there were so many, Gregory, I remember reading the word huffy, which was Gregory's word for a sandwich in Oz. And I remember thinking, oh my God, that's so cool. Sandwiches are their own word. And the way he wrote the novel, you always knew what was going on, even if you, and also, it's just, here's the novel, here's my original with my little highlighted moments, and something that I noticed I highlighted is obviously a big part of our show and our movies, which is the line, animals should be seen and not heard. And I think what's so powerful about that, and why I highlighted it and knew I was going to use it, is that we changed a lot about Gregory's story of Dr. Dillman. Gregory wrote a biologist, a biology professor. We started with that, but it didn't work for us plot-wise. We ended up going into history. But when Gregory seen but not heard. He's taking this, am I using the word aphorism correctly? He's taking this, just embedded in our minds, really old-fashioned, really kind of pathetically, fascistic kind of. Children should be seen and not heard. And when he plugs in that word animals, first of all, it's so fresh. It gets your attention, but it makes you know everything about that culture. If they're saying that about animals, it's fascinating. Because in other words, that's a world where animals are always talking. They're known to be talking. It's not a big deal. And it's saying, you know what, they really shouldn't be talking. And who would you say that about? You would say that about a group that you want to other, as the professor said earlier.
So I know this is a weird term, but I really am honored that the two of you haven't been on 100 panels together and that you chose to come to BroadwayCon. I think that's awesome.
I don't know what we have
And Winnie has a question for Gregory, but before that, if you have a question, please
to.
go
No,
ahead
that
and
was
write
my
it.
question.
There was a question about,
Oh, I know you each had one for each other, right?
I wanted.
Oh, that was the question.
The question was about language, right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'm sorry. But if you have a question, please write it down and raise your hand if you're part of the Broadway Maven team. They'll pick it up. Go ahead.
did you have another question?
10 minutes.
No, do you feel satisfactorily answered? Between my wide reading, my traveling, I have, a boyfriend who was a cultural anthropologist and came back from the highlands of Iran with a lot of information about how he studied a population that was somewhat sequestered from the Western world. And I just sat down with my list of things I felt we needed to know about us in order to make it convincing. And he gave me 35 subheadings, and I had covered about 28 of them just through storytelling instinct. A novelist and an anthropologist are almost the same person, I think.
One second, we're going to keep talking, but if Meg Wood could come up, you're going to ask the next question.
Should I ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay. So the fandom that this novel and the Broadway musical and the movie have created, inspired, and continue to grow are absolutely mind-blowing. Not only from the presence of people in this room, but for all of us. So, what has surprised you about fandom of your novel and of the musical and of the movie?
I consider that I'm a kind of bachelor great uncle to the huge success of Broadway play and the movie, even more so. Now I'm a great uncle to the movie, and that doesn't mean that I don't recognize the legitimate lineage. My DNA has been verified as being involved in Wicked the movie and Wicked the musical. But I have a wonderful advantage because despite being Irish and garrulous, I'm actually fairly shy. So I always could stand behind the skirts of the green-skinned witch because she was always more recognizable on the street than I was. And I live a very private life in Concord, like Thoreau, with my small family and my work. And that's how I like it. Poor Stephen and poor Winnie have been out there fronting the breast of adulation. Go for it. Go for it. You take it on. You do it so well, and I am very happy to be here. And one of the reasons I accepted David's invitation was because we knew you were going to be involved. And that's serious. That's why I came to New York. And I don't get to see you or talk to you as often as I would like. So here we are. But at any rate, I think I said enough.
Meg.
Hi. So it's funny you should say that. This is my first BroadwayCon, and the reason I'm here at BroadwayCon is because I'm a book nerd, and I heard you were going to be here, Gregory, and so I. But my question for you is, how do you take a book that revels so much in the grotesque and depraved, and this is a question for you too, Winnie, and how do you reconcile that tone, those themes of the book with a show that I took my 6-year-old to see last year?
I do it very easily. I can see, and I could see after about the 4th time I saw the show. I saw it 5 times in San Francisco on 5 subsequent nights because I was afraid it would never get to New York and I wanted to memorize it. I wanted to have a memory of every single instant of it. But
We all have that fear.
I could see by the 5th time that though the plot had been enormously condensed, and many of the characters had been condensed, and I think the time frame of the novel has been condensed too. Nonetheless, the place that you arrive at the end of the musical is the identical place that I wanted people to arrive at the end of my novel, which was a lump in the throat and a reminder that what literature, whether it be theater, whether it be novels, brings us to is a reminder of how little time we have to do good with our lives. We must cherish the ones we love, we must say it out loud, we must protect one another, and we must do our work while we have the spirit. That's what you get when you come out of the Cineplex, and I think that's what you get when you close the book, unless you drop the book on your foot when you say something else.
So the next audience question, it doesn't have a name, so I'll ask it. Have either of you read any fan fiction? And if so, have you seen any of the characters or story in another light?
No.
Okay.
I'm speaking for me, I don't know if you guys.
I've not read the fan fiction. I didn't really think that was a good idea. But my daughter would sometimes say to me, my daughter would just report to me, basically she would just say, there's a lot of fan fiction.
So I'm going to invite Topher to come up. And Salamishah, do you have something?
Well, I actually think in a way we're all doing fan fiction. I mean, not to negate what the brilliance of the novel and the musical and the movie, but I was just thinking that on some level, all of this is fan fiction. And then the other thing I was also thinking was how genre changes, because audiences have an expectation of a genre. So when you live in a musical, it is actually quite, you expect it, not so much now, but maybe originally when the book came, but you expect to feel good at the end of it, which is different than a novel necessarily or a movie. So these are thoughts I had, just how the form affects the feeling. And then that may also affect the story and the politics too. So that was just thoughts in my head when you were talking. I'll let it go to someone else.
Topher.
Thank you. I, growing up, was lucky enough my local library had all of L. Frank Baum's original novels.
Oh, wow.
So I grew up knowing that his whole world had only developed it. Huge fan of Richard Oz from the 80s, because he did that one. How many of those had you read ahead of time, and how did his version of the whole world influence your novels?
I was a deprived child because in this way, while I was a child of the library, as well as my parents, a lot of American libraries did not put public funds into the purchasing of L. Frank Baum novels because they considered them not as good and not as worthy of the spending of money. So I grew up with the books by Edward Eager, Half Magic. Yeah, right, thank you. And remember that chapter in 7-Day Magic where Oz is implicated in chapter 2?
That's right.
Go back and find it. At any rate, the kids in Edward Eager books are always talking about how wonderful the Oz books are. But in my public library, there were only the first 2, and I read them repeatedly. I knew there were 12 other volumes, and we were not rich enough to go find them and buy them. There was no such thing as A.B. Brisk. There weren't even that many. There were paperback reissues, has not yet happened that I'm was a kid. So I grew up knowing there was a history that I could not reach. And I think that absence is part of what gave me the appetite to fill in the history.
Go for that, great question.
When you read, I've read all of them, but the witch is such a, in a way, a minor character in Baum's imagination, even if she stands in for indigenous people and stuff like that. So that's what makes your work so brilliant, because it's not like she takes up a lot of space in his imagination.
Even in the Wizard of Oz novel, she's dead halfway through the novel, and then they have to keep traipsing around trying to find the right subway. It's terrible.
So, Winnie, one of the things that I talk about with my students is I believe that Broadway has a genealogy. Hair begat Rent, which begat Hamilton. So my question is,
Absolutely.
what are Wicked's parents and what are its children?
Well,
And the Wizard of Oz is probably not the reader.
Well, Stacy evoked Rodgers and Hammerstein almost immediately when we started. And Rodgers and Hammerstein, you know, I think, well, I don't want to be too reductive. You know, I think that you know, I studied, I would have the incredible honor and privilege of studying with Arthur Lawrence, who was a great American musical theater book writer. And Sondheim and Prince actually gave us a master class. And this was when I was at NYU Musical Theater Program the first year. And Compton Green were there. I'm not just the first time I was there. So the reason I'm mentioning all these incredible luminaries is that I did feel I did, you know, from my 20s when I had the privilege of studying with them, was a huge influence, as you can imagine, and I felt a sense of history. I felt a sense of legacy, because they were only there because they wanted to impart to the next generation what they had learned. That they were all still busy writing. It's not like they had retired and they were relaxing and what can we do now? They were very busy, but they wanted to speak to the next generation. And George Wolf was in my class, and Robert Friedman was in my class, and we drank in their wisdom. So I'm just speaking for myself now. Stephen is another story, because Stephen is an amazing songwriter and storyteller. So he would have to answer for himself, but I think to a great extent, you know, that generation that I'm invoking, that generation, we all knew each other. I knew them as a student, and Stephen was very, very young when he collaborated with Bernstein. He was, you know, he did Mass with Bernstein. He knew all those people. And we, like as I said before, we grew up singing those songs and listening. I listened compulsively, obsessively to those cast albums, just because I love them, just out of love. So I would say, first of all, I want to use the word love. You know, there's just so much about the writing of Wicked and about just being drawn to write with Stephen and our feelings about Gregory. It just has to do with a sense of a deep connection, of a heart connection, and I think that we just you know, fell in love at some point with this art form and wanted to learn about it, and that's how you learn about it, is by writing.
So I'm going to stand up and applaud because I am so impressed.